Hi, can you hear me? Great. So, nice to see all of you. And I'm looking very much forward to the conversation we'll have. Today, my first suggestion as chair would actually be if people that are far in the back would move up a little bit, because I am looking very much forward to the presentations, but really also to the discussion. We'll have 4 speakers today who will speak to us about the nexus between institutions and aid. First, Gail, who will be speaking to us about understanding Somalia's state-building processes with that perspective. Chari Kangoye, is that correct? Who will speak to us about aid, institutional transplants, and democracy. Then on to Alessandra Belmonte, who I believe will be with us online to talk to us about donors for tax morale. And then finally, Abrams Taken, who will ask and provide insights into the question as to whether aid fragmentation affect tax revenue dynamics in developing countries. So when we have such a setup, we have 1.5 hours. We are already running a bit after schedule. You have 15 minutes each for your presentation, and I will sort of try to politely let you know when you're approaching that, because we do want to hear what you're saying, both in your presentations, but actually also in the discussion. Without further ado, Gail, please.
Yes. Yeah, seems we. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the organizers of this conference. So just 2 words of introduction. So I was working on Somalia for 5 years. I'm now based in Dakar, working for the World Bank on governance issues and public sector harmonization. And so this one was actually discussed quite at length among donors in Somalia, or in Nairobi also for people working on Somalia. So why did we start this? Is that especially after the normalization somehow of the situation or the relations with the donors in Somalia, and after also this issue with Afghanistan that we all know, there were some increasing questions about aid effectiveness, despite increased service delivery, because we had focused a lot on service delivery. So there was, okay, what should be done next? And of course, it's especially important in Somalia, because we focused a lot on this service delivery, but we know that there's still a lot of issues. I think that also in the World Bank last year, 2021, we published a regional study on social contracts and how it could actually impact what we are doing in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that we also wanted to basically acknowledge and take into account the work of political scientists or anthropologists in Somalia that had worked on this. So why is it important to try to have understand the social contract and how it may impact actually what we do? Is we felt that it was important because there are many aspects in Somalia that sometimes are a bit, ignored. First is that what we found out is that there's really an exclusionary elite bargain, and sometimes actually it's strengthened by the international community. And but there's also a lot of variations in Somalia, and there are different federal member states. And for example, if you take Puntland, which is in the north of Somalia, you have some sort of social contract in a sense that you have more security, more education, and also that the taxation is higher. But what is really important across Somalia, and we've seen it again and again, is that you have a traditional clan-based responsive social contract, and with the limits that it has, because it's also largely exclusionary. So this idea, in this context, we wanted to know, okay, what could be done or what should be done from the international community. So I will say a couple of words about this analytical framework that was defined. And of course, there are really many different frameworks about the social contract, but I think that it has been discussed more and more in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that it's important. And then we had also done some qualitative assessment, especially focused on security, education, and taxation in Somalia in different places. And then I will discuss about the implication for donor interventions in this country. So just, so the analytical framework about this social contract, basically the idea, which is quite simple, is to say that you have a citizen-state bargain, and they depend a lot of different aspects about the social outcomes. So yes, if it's inclusive, if you have some openness, and also it's also important to take into account what are the expectations of the people and of the communities. So how to measure it? So we've tried, but of course it's still work in progress. Is that it depends on let's say 6 dimensions. One is about the civil capacity, so the capacity for the citizens, for the community to really try to mobilize, cooperate, or organize themselves to resolve some collective action problems. The state capacity is quite obvious. I think the thickness, it's the quantity of public goods, services that are provided by the state. And of course, inclusiveness, openness, and alignment is what you have in terms of what are the expectations from the communities and what is being delivered. So we did some, and of course it's not such a surprise, but you have a really weak state-citizen bargain and a weak social outcome compass in Somalia. It means that basically you have a low state capacity, low civil capacity. You have a problem of you have a huge problem of inclusions, and also that the state doesn't deliver much. So I think that also what is interesting, that in the last years we've seen some increasing expectations from and of course we have in the paper a lot of discussions about the sources of the data and so on. But I think that what we've seen, and actually we've seen more and more protests and social protests, is that in the last years, with, let's say, this also maybe this normalization and a bit in some parts of the country less conflict, we've seen some increasing demands from the people. So in terms of the qualitative assessments, the idea was first to focus on security, because we know that in fragile states the most important expectation from the state is security. So the idea was, okay, who provides security overall in a country? Who does finance it? How is it perceived? Especially the national army, and what are the expectations for population? Then it was about education, the same thing, more or less same questions. What are the expectations? Who does provide education? Who does finance it? And then finally about the taxation, because we know that it's important, because Somalia is one of the lowest in terms of revenue collection. So is there any fiscal contract? Is there any fiscal competition across Somalia? So first of all, what we found out that you usually have, which is confirmed in some other countries where I work now, in West Africa, is that people understand that the state is quite dysfunctional, and so in general, the expectations are not so important, except security. For them, is that security is the highest priority and should be really tackled. And of course, it's not the easiest one. And education usually comes second. But in terms of service delivery, the expectations are not necessarily high. I think also what is important, especially for donors, is that we know that there's a large literature about who delivers matter, and especially for state legitimacy in NFCV countries, in fragile states. So it means that having service delivery increased just for the sake of it, if there's no really link to the state or to the authorities or local authorities, actually may not necessarily increase the legitimacy. And it can even undermine it because, in a sense, they can feel that if it's done through NGOs and so on, that actually the state it confirms that the state is dysfunctional. What we've seen, and it's really not new in Somalia, actually, it dates back even from independence. There's no really fiscal contract, especially between the citizens and the federal state, or even the federal government or the federal states. And we see a huge heterogeneity of taxation. And of course, it's important if you really want to have let's say, a functional state to have some sort of revenue sharing mechanism for equalization. And also, not so surprising, there's huge spatial inequality in Somalia and problem of equity, especially regarding to some access to services. So in terms, for example, of heterogeneity, we did a study where we studied quite a number of border posts and some bordering regions. And you can see first on the graph is that Somalia is really low. But even in terms of the data, some border posts are really collecting actually much more than what they would do at, let's say, the federal member states level. And meaning that actually some places are somehow self-sufficient compared to others, and they can really deliver services and so on. So you really have some local dynamic that are very different across the territory. So in terms of the implications, what can it be or what should it be? I think that we discussed it quite at length in Somalia with our partners. Somehow we have supported this elite bargain at the expense of the citizen bargain, meaning that we've usually worked, and of course we have our own constraint in our organization, but we focused a lot at working at the federal and the federal member states level, which means that we've somehow reinforced and not necessarily accountability vis-à-vis the communities of citizens. There's usually a trade-off between stability and social contract ideas. In the case of Somalia, there's always this discussion about, okay, we need to have some sort of stability, but sometimes it really may be good in the short term, but it may have also some impact in the medium, long term. So in terms of, and I think that, of course, there are some limits, and some of the things are not necessarily easy to do, especially in Somalia, where you have still some parts of the country that are not under the, let's say, the control of the state or of the regional authorities. So what is important is to have to be selective, and of course, security is really a part of the equation. In the World Bank, we are not necessarily the best place, but I think it's important to take into account this. We had also, we've tried collectively to work more on budget transparency or media protection and so on. It's really important. It's not necessarily, it has not been necessarily done. We have also, I think that there was this debate in Somalia for a long time that should we work more with the federal member states or the federal government, but actually somehow they're part of the same let's say, bargain system. And so it's important also to create more accountability at the federal member states level. And and it's important to try to measure the changes, if there would be some changes on the citizen-state relations. So yes, just being a practitioner, having been worked for almost 2 decades in the World Bank, and especially in fragile states, I think that usually we have a disconnect between the literature and the development practitioners, and I think that it's really important to take into account that, and I'm really trying, working now, for example, in the Sahel, to somehow to incentivize the staff to try to read more and to try to put more in our design projects, some of the things that have been known for a while in the literature. I think it's also important to to acknowledge the limits of a quantitative or a simplistic view of development. I think that it's important to have, of course, funding is important. But what we realize, especially in fragile states, is that state legitimacy depends on security. Okay, yes, it costs money, but it's also about justice and about fairness and things like that. And that it's not necessarily, let's say, a large chunk of money for that. But the fundamental question is that, is it really possible to change positively a social contract in a country? And I think we are still struggling, and I think it's probably a long-term perspective, which means also that it has some implications for us as donors, that we really need to have a very long-term engagement. And that's, I think I would say. I hope that I was on time. I think I should. And so thanks so much for your attention, and looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Terry is next, and while you go up there and get ready, can I just compliment what you said on the engagement between practitioners and academic researchers. And we actually have two practitioners who have thought a lot about this issue and have done research. So I think that's an excellent opportunity we have here today. Jerry, over to you.
How does this thing work? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this session on the ED institution Nexus. So hope everything is going, has been going smoothly, and that you're all enjoying the conference. Definitely cannot start without saying a big word of thanks to the UNU wider and the GPDC for putting this together and getting all of us here for this very important event. Topic is very, very relevant. My name is Thierry Kangoye. I'm a Policy and Strategy Officer at the African Development Bank. So the paper I'm going to present is actually a research I started a while ago as part of a broad research agenda aiming at understanding both the determinants and consequences of aid effectiveness with a focus on institutional building. So this is a menu of the presentations. I think it's quite straightforward because we don't have much time. So I'm going to quickly go in a first step through what has mainly motivated the research and how it's meant to contribute to the literature. Then I will present some few stylized facts based on our data set, and then after which I will briefly touch upon our empirical strategy and the main findings before discussing a few policy implications. So now let me start with the motivation for undertaking the research. So I think there is no need to kind of elaborate much on the importance of institutions for economic development. I believe there is a strong consensus that on the point that institutions are the root cause of development. And next to that, is quite large literature has kind of attempted to understand how countries get good institutions. And some actually have focused on institutional borrowing, which is simply taking one set of institutions from one country to another. And also, interestingly, have tried to explain the extent to which this can actually explain part of the institutional crisis that some developing countries have been facing. And we actually went a step further and tried to connect that to the aid effectiveness literature, which is also a very important topic because a lot of institutions-related outcomes have been attributed to aid. So broadly speaking, our motivation for the research is essentially kind of contribute to a better understanding of the role of aid in shaping institutions. So on the literature, so where do we stand? As I mentioned, the paper actually connects two different streams of the literature. So the first is on the determinant of institutions from a kind of historical perspective. So I think if you have a look back over history, so you will see that actually borrowing institutions, if I can call it so, from one place to another has been actually a widespread phenomenon, and actually can be held responsible for a quite large part of the institutional variation between countries. For instance, you've got the French legal system that was exported to Spain, Portugal, some countries in West Africa, and in some part of Asia. German legal system was transplanted into Austria, in Japan, and so on, so many cases. And you've got a number of authors discussing and providing evidence that the transfer of institutions is key in determining the institutional settings of the host countries. So we have got, for instance, Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson in the very interesting paper of 2001, who actually focused on the impact of colonial experiences on the area and current state of institutions. So we have also got authors like Engelbert in 2000 that, by the way, we are referring a lot in our paper. We discussed the hypothesis that the extent to which colonial institutions clashed with the indigenous ones can significantly explain the state of institutions in the developing countries today. And some other authors like Dia in his paper in 1996, I think, have tried to demonstrate that the weak institutional capacity of developing countries lies actually in the fact, in the structural and functional disconnections between the informal indigenous institutions and the formal institutions that have been actually borrowed from outside those countries. So, and of course, the other stream of the literature is on the aid effectiveness, which has actually raised the issue of the potentially damaging effect on aid on the recipient country's institutions, blaming aid, for instance, for fueling corruption, weakening democratic accountability, quality of government. Of course, that's one part of the literature. We've got another part concluding to the opposite effect, that aid actually can help build institutions. So it's definitely not a clear-cut literature. So the purpose of this research is to explore the hypothesis that the failure of institutional transplants can account for some of the reported adverse effect of aid on recipient countries' institutions. So this is the research questions, and the postulate behind is that countries in which indigenous institutions were not successfully meshed with colonial institutions ended up with weak post-colonial institutions which persisted over time. So, and then we then assume that this created a base for the weak pre-existing institutional conditions that is making aid to have a negative impact on institutions. So this is purely an econometric study. So very quickly on the data, so we made use of a sample of 68 developing countries over 1984-2003. We used the ICRG index of democratic accountability as a proxy for institutional quality. So that index basically assesses how responsive is a government to its people. So in aid dependency is measured by scaling official development assistance by the GDP and also by the GNI. And finally, we relied on the literature to select the set of controls that we have included in the model, including like ethno-linguistic fractalization, legal system, the share of exports, primary exports in the gross national income, urbanization rates, the landlocked status, and so on. So now, we relied on the approach of Engelbert 2000, as I was mentioning, to construct our proxy of the disconnection between the transplanted norms and the indigenous ones, which we assume to have translated into a legitimacy and accountability crisis of state institutions. So the proc side is essentially a dummy variables indicated whether or not a country is categorized as having illegitimate state, quote unquote, or not. And the process is, as you can see, sorry, I think it may be looking a bit crowded. So actually for each country in the sample, so we have a set of 5 dichotomous steps. And for each of those phases, the country is basically tested for illegitimacy and assigned a score of 0 or 1. And at any step, if the country scores 1, so the process ends and the country is given the status illegitimate. And if not, we move on to the next stage. And if the country does not score 1 by the final step 5, so it is considered to have an illegitimate state. So the first step assesses whether or not a country had a colonial history, which allows actually to exclude exclusively focus on the historical channel of institutional transplant. And all the remaining steps deal with the impact of settlement, political independence, and the post-colonial time on the pre-existing social norms. And the basic assumption, of course, is that if there were no human settlement before colonization, so we cannot obviously talk about a conflict between pre- and post-colonial institutions. So we ended up having 28 countries being categorized as having a legitimate state, and 40 countries as having illegitimate states. So this is just a few slide stats on state illegitimacy. So this seems to show that, as you can see, countries with legitimate states seems to perform better than the other group of the countries with regard to a range of institutional variables, including like democratic accountability, government corruption, the rule of law, bureaucratic quality, and democracy. And the group of illegitimate states country also tend to have slightly lower level of income, and it also seems to be 3 times more aid dependent, which could actually suggest that aid may be feeding directly illegitimacy, directly through an inadequate transfer of formal institutions or norms. So now how did you go about the identification strategy? So it's a very simple econometric model cross-section. Democratic accountability is the dependent variables on which we are testing the impact of both aid and state illegitimacy, the dummy. Since we're focusing on long-term effects on purpose, because as you know, institutions tend to evolve very slowly over time. So actually, this is a mistake. So that is average over the whole period of the study, not over 5 years periods. This is actually a specification we're testing, but the final one that we put in the paper is based on purely cross-country regressions. So, importantly, we try to address the potential endogeneity of the aid variables because, as you may know, aid institutions, they are kind of affecting each other. There's kind of reverse causality bias. So we use 2 main instrumental variables that are the conventional deficit and the total outstanding debt of the 5 main donors for each country that were weighted by the reverse bilateral geographical distance from the donor. And the rationale behind those instruments is that the better the donor country's financial are, so the more likely they will be to provide, or more willing they will be to provide aid. And I think those instruments have been used in the empirical literature on aid by authors like Tavares in a very interesting paper in 2003. And actually they have proved to be a very good instrument. Finally, we are ruling out the, if I say reverse causation, correlation between state illegitimacy variable and democratic accountability. So just based on the expectation that for developing countries, those 2 variables can be just determined by different factors. Okay, very quickly again. So in terms of the findings, so what have we got? These are the results of the probate regressions on the impact of aid on state illegitimacy. After addressing the issue of endogeneity of the aid on the aid variables, so we get the evidence that an increase in aid seems to be associated with a higher likelihood that the recipient country will have an illegitimate state, suggesting that aid may have a direct impact of state illegitimacy. So that's one. Second, as you can see from that table, I hope everyone can see, it's a bit small, that higher levels of aid dependency are significantly and negatively associated with democratic accountability. Interestingly, after controlling for the illegitimacy proxile, so we find that aid has no longer statistically significant effect, which tend to support the argument that state legitimacy plays an important role in explaining the institutional quality just beyond the impact of aid. And finally, in column 4, we included the full set of controls in the regressions and still find that state illegitimacy remain detrimental for democratic accountability, with it continuing to have a neutral effect. So, and as we can see, and the result seems to suggest that having an illegitimate state leads to a reduction in the level of democratic accountability for what, 0.8%. And of course, we tested the robustness of those findings to try to exclude a few outliers, try to use different measures of aid and different specifications, and then we still get the same result. But of course, it's still a work in progress. What policy message can we gather from those findings? First point is that the result seems to suggest that the damaging impact of aid on institutions seems to be symptoms of historical factors. Second point is that the findings also seem to suggest that institutional transplants are not damaging per se. The most important point rather being that paying attention to the pre-existing local conditions and the potential uniqueness of the local contexts that should be considered when importing institutions. So this kind of echoes the debate over the point that institutional reforms need to be domestic and demand-driven, which is an important condition for legitimacy, state legitimacy. So third, and in connection to the aid effectiveness debate, I think aid itself can be given a direct role in making institutional transplant more successful. For instance, well-designed technical assistance program aiming at building effective institutions, reinforcing conditionalities, but again, with always the need to consider the local context. I think I will finish by putting some caveats on the research. As I mentioned, it's still a work in progress, mainly on the way we are proxying the state illegitimacy or the crisis arising from the disconnection between indigenous and importing institutions, and especially trying to better capture the dynamic aspect of it. But for us, it's definitely an avenue for future research. So I think I will stop there and maybe turn over back to you, hoping that I have not exhausted all the time. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
You're actually right on time.
Okay, super. Good.
Is it on? Yes, great. Thank you so much, Thierry Kangoye. And if I'm not mistaken, we'll move on to the virtual presentation that we have. Is that correct? With Alessandro Belmonte. Unless Alessandro is in the room. Then apologies. Would it be helpful that we move to the fourth presentation first, so you find out, or do you have Alessandro online?
Can you hear me now?
We hear you.
Okay, great.
Yes, please go ahead.
Right. Okay, so thank you for having me. So let me tell you that this is a joint work with two colleagues of mine, which is Vincenzo Bove and Jessica Di Salvatore, which are both from University of Warwick, and that this is a paper on which we explore whether foreign hate affect motivation people to pay taxes. All right. So let me give you. Should I share my slides? Or
yes,
hello?
please. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. Open system preferences. Give me some. Yeah. I don't know what. Yeah, I have to find out how to do this. Yeah. Maybe you can move the slides, and I will comment on it. Okay, excellent. Okay, great. Okay, so we can move to the next slide number 2, just to give you a motivation to, why do we think studying, motivation to pay taxes is important, especially in the developing world. So, the classical framework in economics, but also political science, is the Allingham and Salmo, paper, in which, efficient to pay taxes or evading is based on a expected monetary cost, which depend on the probability of getting caught by tax authority and the amount of the sanction. Okay, and the probability of this getting caught is what is generally called, fiscal capacity. Okay, the capacity of the state to raise taxes and and catch tax evader. But there is really abundant, literature in the last 10 to 20 years that have shown empirically that people do pay taxes for other reasons, mainly immaterial one, and that people pay taxes most of the time because they believe paying taxes is right, okay, because they're intrinsically motivated to pay taxes, okay? And most of the time, we do pay taxes even if we don't face any threat of punishment, okay? And let me argue that this is particularly important in weak state with little fiscal capability by moving to the next slide, in which we have this simple, framework in which there is a dynamic complementarity between fiscal capacity and tax morale, which is motivation to pay taxes. So imagine first, a country with low fiscal capability. This country doesn't have, a capacity to raise taxes. So little resources will be collected to provide public goods and services. And because of that, because people receive little in exchange, they will be really low motivated to pay tax. Okay, so this is a story of low expectation that Kyle told us before, basically. So this is the first row. The second row, the second arrow basically is that because fiscal capacity is low, the collection of these resources, public resources, will be based on voluntary compliance. But because voluntary compliance, because motivation is low, voluntary compliance will be low as well. So this basically generates, the vicious cycle, and that's if we look at it on the long run, this generates what Tim Baisley called the poverty trap. Okay. So if we move to the next slide, this is our question is, motivating question is how to break this trap. And if we move to the other slide, to the next one, we see that we focus on the role of foreign aid, okay? And foreign aid, can foreign aid basically be useful in breaking this trap, this poverty trap? This is basically what we ask ourselves. You know, I mean, there are many channels for which foreign aid can affect this dynamic complementarity between institution and culture. You know, there have been several papers, for example, Thierry once was on institutional channels, right? So how foreign aids can affect fiscal capacity through an institutional building, but this requires time to develop. So this is a medium to long run effect, medium to long run channel. We focus exclusively on the second channel, which is a cultural channel, which is a very short run. And the idea we have in mind is that when people observe, the start of a project, a foreign aid project, you receive a state building signal that might be a good signal. For example, we hypothesize that if they see that the government is cooperating with the donors about tax cooperation or tax authority, fiscal building, this signal the fact that there is a state building process ongoing. Okay, so say something finally is moving. But if the citizen see a project which is basically only a public good provision one, they can receive a bad signal and say, oh well, so this is a public good that the state is supposed to deliver to us, but this is something that a donor, an NGO, for example, is doing for us. Okay, so this is basically what we have in mind. Okay, and if we move to the other slide, to the next slide, we see that we design basically an empirical strategy by focus on the very short run that allow us to to focus on the short run and to kill the medium to long run effect going through institution. Okay, so this is not a paper on institution, but this is a paper on the cultural effect of foreign aid on people motivation to take part to the state building process. Okay, and what is interesting in our opinion is that it's really unclear, as I mentioned earlier, that what is the direction of this effect. Okay, because we hypothesize, as I just said, that projects promoting tax cooperation may signal state building to taxpayer. And we also hypothesize that donors providing themselves with public good, can signal a negative signal on state building process. Okay, and then we look also at the type of donors, but this is something I don't have time to get into it, so I will skip on this presentation. Okay, so basically we focus here on foreign aid composition. Okay, so we'll be very quick on the data. So the next slide, because I've seen many papers in this conference that have been using aid data, which is this big database in which there is invaluable information on each project. We focus in particular on World Bank projects and in China, but as I said, I'm going to focus in this presentation on World Bank. And particularly, we focus on the geocoded version of this project. So we really know where these projects are based and which is the area of operation of this project. And we also have the information, the sectors of this intervention, which allow us to distinguish whether the intervention is a public good provision project or a state building project. Okay, so which is basically our story. So next slide, we have a second source of data, which is from Afrobarometer. Even in this case, I don't need much words to explain what Afrobarometer is, because it's really high quality survey data, which is invaluable if one wants to study, attitudes of African people. And even in this case, we use the georeferenced version, so we know exactly the location of the interviewees. Okay, and we use several rounds. In this presentation, we have only round 4 and 5, but we actually received recently all the other rounds, so we just checked it, and results are quite unchanged. Okay, and if we move to the next slide, you see basically a map of the country we tackled in this study. And if we move to slides number 11, we see particularly how this project are located. Okay, the spatial distribution of this project in the yellow. Every dot in yellow is a World Bank project, and in red we have also China one during this period, 2014. But as I said, we just enlarged our sample very recently. Okay, so let me explain what we do with this data. So what is our empirical strategy in slide 12. So we basically use two empirical strategies with pros and cons. So this allows us to move along, the trade-off between external validity and internal validity. So let me start from the first one, which is the most external valid one. So what we do here, we check the list of all the projects in the country. For example, this is Burkina Faso. You see in the map. We checked this project that, for example, started 3 months before the start of fieldwork, Afrobarometer fieldwork in Burkina Faso, and then we see which project is located in which region. Okay, and so we treat as treated individuals, those individuals living in the region that are a recipient of a project that started really recently. Okay, so these are, for example, in the map, the green region, and the orange one instead are the one that didn't receive any foreign aid in 3 months time, say. So what we do here is basically to compare the level of tax morale, okay, so motivation to pay taxes between individuals living in these regions and individuals living in the region, in the orange one, is those that didn't receive any foreign aid intervention, okay? And we, use a region fixed effect, so because we are using several rounds, so we see time variation, we use time variation. We use round fixed effect, country times round fixed effect, we control for individuals and blah, 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 okay? The problem of this empirical strategy is that the location of this project might be endogenous to some regional characteristics. Okay,
Alessandro.
And,
Alessandro.
Yeah.
Sorry
Yeah.
to disturb you. You are fast approaching your 15 minutes, and we really also do want to hear your results and conclusions. So here the practitioner.
I'm not. Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'm not showing any results, and I'm going to focus on the empirical strategy and just tell you, these are the results, okay, without tables. So I'm gonna use my time on the empirical strategy. So is that fair enough?
Up to you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the problem is endogeneity. So we move to another empirical strategy, which is empirical strategy number 2 in slide number 13. And what we do here is basically to focus, to use a project fixed effect. So you use variation within a project, okay? And we basically here check whether during the survey fieldwork, there is a start of a project, okay? So this allows us to look at a project. For example, here we have Malawi, an example in Malawi, in which a project started during the fieldwork. Okay, so the project is an unexpected event during fieldwork, and this allows us to compare individuals that have been interviewed before the days immediately before the start of the project, which is the orange dots, which with individuals that have been interviewed the days immediately after. Okay, so a difference is causal in the sense that we absorb the problem of the project endogeneity. Okay, so we include seasonal fixed effect, other individuals, blah 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 blah. So these are the overview of the results, basically. So I'm not providing any tables because we have just 15 minutes. So what we find basically in both cases, in both empirical strategy, a mild yet positive impact of foreign aid on tax morale. our contribution is basically on, on heterogeneous effects, as I said. So we find basically that this effect is driven by a project which is aimed at building state capacity on taxation. And we find instead that projects that are public good provision based are basically as an aggregate effect, and projects on health remarkably depress people's tax morale. This is what we find. We also have some results on China and corruption, but I'm going to skip it. Okay, let me just conclude. Okay, so we find basically that we find evidence on foreign aid being a potential instrument for breaking this poverty trap between low fiscal capacity and low tax morale, which is, I think it's quite important. So we find that projects on fiscal capacity building signal state building, whereas projects on public good provision signal state weak. And this is particularly important if you see the data and see that the actual composition of foreign aid is really on the side of public good provision rather than on fiscal capacity. Okay, so this basically concludes my presentation. All right.
Thank you so much. And since you can only hear through my mic,
Okay, thanks to you.
I hope you were able to hear that. And with that, I invite Abrams Tegem to the floor.
Okay, hi everyone. This is quite high. All right, thanks for joining. This is the last session before lunch, so I wouldn't keep you here much longer than you need to be. Do I change the slides with this, or? Okay. All right, so following on from Alessandro's presentation, this is going to be based on taxation as well. So most developing countries try to raise as much revenue as they can to, cover their development expenses, pay down their debts, and actually reduce their vulnerabilities to further debt shocks. But for them to be able to raise revenues, they need technical assistance from donors. They need foreign assistance as well. And most donors actually provide conditions in terms of how much revenues the countries can raise. So what we are trying to show in this paper with my colleague, Ali Compaore, is that if aid is fragmented, and by that I mean if aid is received from a multitude of donors without some kind of coordination, then it has deleterious effects on tax revenue in developing countries. So the overview of the presentation, it has a background and motivation, what we do, the conceptual framework, the data, empirical specification, the results, conclusion, and references. It's 28 slides, but I wouldn't be able to go through all of them. And I'm hoping you don't get bogged down by the numbers, but we're more interested in developing the conceptual framework, because while there's been a huge literature on the effects of aid fragmentation on other kinds of development outcomes, there has not been any research on the effects of aid fragmentation on taxation. So this is a novel study in itself. So in terms of the background and motivation, I can't exactly see from here. Okay, well. Oh, okay. Well, I'll watch the screen while you watch me. So there are outstanding features of aid which undermine its effectiveness. So there is a huge literature on aid volatility, as well as a burgeoning literature on fragmentation and aid proliferation. Fragmentation is an increase in the number of donor-funded activities in recipient countries. So basically, it's the degree to which a given country's total aid budget is provided by different donors. Proliferation, on the other hand, is an increase in the number of donors involved in financing and delivery of total official aid in recipient countries. For the purposes of this study, fragmentation and proliferation are used interchangeably. There are growing concerns about donor proliferation in developing countries. For example, a 2017 paper by Annen and Moores shows that in 1960, The average recipient country had just 3 donors. Meanwhile, in 2011, the average country had about 23 donors. And if we were to look at, let's say, 2020, with the advent of the new donors and the growing importance of non-DAC donors like China, then the average country actually has more than 23. So there have been initiatives by the aid community to kind of curb the growing proliferation of donors and ensure some coordination amongst them. So some of the initiatives include the Rome Declaration on Harmonization, the Paris Declaration in 2005, and relatively recently, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. There is a broad literature on aid effectiveness. I mean, I wouldn't want to go into that. As far back as 1994, there was a very popular paper by Burnside and Dollar. And I'm sure when I got into my PhD research, the literature on aid effectiveness had already been exhausted. So this is not an addition to the aid effectiveness literature. It's kind of taking a different turn and looking at the effects of aid fragmentation. So in terms of aid fragmentation, what does the literature show? It leads to an inefficient supply of aid in recipient countries. And by inefficient supply, what we are saying is that development outcomes are influenced by a vast array of resources, some of them provided by the recipient country and others provided by the donors. And inefficiency means that the average donor, because they are competing with other donors, are more interested in boosting their flags, so to speak, and they are more interested in their own interests, which leads to a suboptimal allocation of aid in recipient countries. It also raises donors' transaction costs. In the next couple of slides, you'll see what transaction costs are. Raises recipients' direct and indirect administrative costs, which are also transaction costs. And it has a negative effect on domestic institutions, which overall undermines aid effectiveness. These are some of the potential negative effects of aid fragmentation, but in terms of sound econometric methodology, the results are tenuous and there are no systemic patterns across countries. So some studies find a positive relationship, while others find a negative relationship. But for the purposes of taxation, what we argue is that the negative relationship is more likely, there's going to be more of a preponderance for a negative relationship than a positive one. So what we do, the paper adds to the literature on aid fragmentation by analyzing and quantifying the tax cost of aid fragmentation in recipient countries. The topic is relevant for 3 reasons. First, because of the importance of tax revenue in financing development and reducing vulnerability to shocks. The enduring importance of aid, donors, and donor agencies in developing countries, and incentives to initiate tax reforms. By incentives to initiate tax reforms, I mean developing fiscal capacity requires large fiscal and institutional investment, especially investments in terms of enforcement and compliance structures. But then again, developing fiscal capacity also requires expending administrative and political effort in developing, which means that there are very strong incentives for reforms, but like every other kind of reform, it creates winners and losers. And if those incentives or the negative incentives, if they become insurmountable, then it's very difficult to initiate the reform. And in the context of taxation, we would like to show that interpreting the results of aid fragmentation is best understood as the absence of a lead donor or the absence of a lead donor to encourage sustained engagement with developing countries such that it leads to slippages in reform, which lead to a reduction in tax revenues. So the conceptual framework, aid fragmentation is going to negatively impact tax revenues through the high bureaucratic costs. So by bureaucratic costs, we are talking about the costs of meeting various donors and organizing meetings with donors and the cost of understanding their various procurement and reporting requirements. If those costs are too high, it reduces incentives to invest in physical capacity. And like I said, those incentives depend a lot on the huge outlays and investments in terms of receiving and collecting revenue. Aid fragmentation also leads to an increase in short-run transaction costs, so for both the donors and the recipients. The donors' transaction costs are in terms of the resources which are disbursed as aid, but do not go to the recipient country as a direct resource transfer. So they can be seen as variable costs in terms of their buildings and wages and salaries of the staff in developing countries. and also in terms of their travel expenses. There are also collective action problems, which is the dilemma between the donor having to respond to the various recipient countries' development objectives, but also to respond to the donors' own domestic pressures and their own interests, especially in how they can justify their aid finance to their own parliament. So if the donors have those very strong collective action problems, then again it leads to suboptimal allocation of aid, such that each donor is interested in their own agenda, and it creates rent-seeking and corruption practices across developing countries. What we try to show is that the composition of taxes is also important. With reform to broad-based taxes more difficult and expensive to initiate than reforms to narrow-based taxes. So narrow-based taxes are going to be like goods and services taxes, excises, and trade taxes. Meanwhile, broad taxes are your standard direct taxes, that's PIT, CIT, and also taxes on accounting categories like the VAT. And what we show is that the fiscal and institutional investments, as well as the political and administrative efforts, differ between these types of taxes. So those investments and efforts are much larger for broad-based taxes than they are for narrow-based taxes. And we have some 3 key reasons why those differences are palpable. So first, there are differences in tax design, enforcement, and administration, which manifest themselves as differences in the required investment to collect those taxes. For example, to be able to collect a broad-based tax like the CIT, the PIT, and the VAT, it's very important to invest in technological advancement, invest in building the legislative ability to deal with tax avoidance. And for example, the VAT, it's also important to invest in a very sound VAT refund system. Conversely, to collect taxes like trade taxes or excises, all you have to do is just observe the trade flows, and the border is one of the easiest places where you can observe a trade flow, as well as observing the consumption patterns. There are also differences in fiscal contracts, which elicit quasi-voluntary compliance. By fiscal contract, it's an exchange between the government and the taxpayers. So taxpayers pay their taxes, and in exchange, the government provides goods and services on a broad scale, which is meant to benefit the public. For broad-based taxes, because they are not exactly observable, it deals a lot on quasi-voluntary compliance. So the tax payers have to file their tax returns, and they need to be honest about their tax returns. But then again, like I said, for the narrow-based taxes like trade, all you have to do is just observe the trade patterns at the border, and it doesn't require some very strong compliance. So the difference in the fiscal costs, again, is going to influence how broad-based taxes are raised. And finally, there are also differences in compliance and administrative costs. So in terms of the data, we use a balanced panel of 90 developing countries over 2000 to 2020. We get our aid data from the OECD Development Assistance Committee. We get our tax data from one of UNUIDA's primary data sets, which is the government revenue data set. So we get total taxes as well as the components of taxes. That's direct and indirect, as well as the components of those like CIT, PIT, VAT, and the like. We also get data for control variables from the World Development Indicators and the World Governance Indicators. I have 5 minutes, so I'll just breeze through. That's the aid fragmentation index. We follow the literature and get what we call the Herfindahl index of aid fragmentation. So essentially, what we're trying to show is the degree to which a given country's total aid budget is provided by various donors, and which is what the formula shows. So this is just the evolution of aid fragmentation, which is quite high in sub-Saharan Africa. And the aid fragmentation index actually ranges from 0 to 1. So the higher it is, the more fragmented aid is, and the lower it is, the less fragmented aid is. So this is our empirical specification. It's a dynamic model where total non-resource tax revenue is a dependent variable. The aid fragmentation index is our key independent variable. Z is a vector of covariates, and then we also include country-specific characteristics and time-varying factors. We follow the literature in choosing the various covariates, so we have financial sector development, aid as a percentage of GDP, openness to trade, agriculture value added, resource rent, and the quality of institutions. So the methodology, we have the standard endogeneity concerns there in terms of reverse causality, in terms of simultaneity, and in terms of measurement error. I wouldn't go into too much detail about this, but for example, reverse causality shows that lower levels of taxation due to multiple constraints may lead to more and more diversified aid. And I'm guessing, even if I didn't say anything about this, it's always going to be a question about endogeneity in econometrics. So we use the system GMM estimator, which I really wouldn't talk much about. It's going to get us bogged down and there is no time, but I'm happy to discuss it over lunch after I've had my coffee. So these are the baseline results. Aid fragmentation has a negative effect on taxation. I don't know if you can see from behind. Total taxes show a negative effect, direct taxes, CIT, PIT, and VAT. So this kind of fits into the narrative we are trying to show here, that aid fragmentation has a negative effect on taxation. The effects may be small, minus 0.03, but the effects are negative nonetheless. And we also see that for the broad-based taxes, like our CIT, PIT, and VAT, there are negative effects. Meanwhile, for broader indirect taxes, trade taxes, and goods and services taxes, there are no effects, which is what we try to explain here. Fragmented aid increases the bureaucratic costs of aid, like I mentioned earlier, and it also produces collective action problems. What we also see is that the negative effects are stronger for broad-based taxes relative to narrow-based taxes. And even in terms of, direct taxes, the effects are stronger for the CIT than for the PIT. And a very nice explanation for that is that the CIT is more mobile, hence it's more susceptible to tax avoidance. So in terms of the fiscal and institutional investments needed to collect and administer the tax, as well as the administrative and political effort expended to collect and administer the tax, is going to be more important for CIT than for PIT, which is intuitive because in most developing countries, the PIT comes entirely from the government, so it's more observable than for the CIT. The results based on institutional quality, we find that aid fragmentation has a negative effect for all levels of institutions. Institutional quality in itself increases tax revenue mobilization, which concurs with the literature, but in an interaction term between aid fragmentation and institutional quality doesn't have a significant effect, except for political stability and for government effectiveness. So what this shows is institutional variables themselves are important for tax revenue mobilization, but in terms of an indirect or mediating effect, they don't necessarily mitigate the negative effects of aid fragmentation across countries. We do one last round of robustness analysis where we split countries by their level of development, and we argue that low-income countries have more structural and political challenges in raising revenue. Likewise, they depend more on aid from varying donors compared to non-low-income countries. So it's fair to assume that their effects are going to differ by level of development. Aid fragmentation reduces tax revenue across both sets of countries, but an interaction term between aid fragmentation and the income level is insignificant, which shows that irrespective of the country's level of development, then aid fragmentation has no effect. We split countries by the level of development following the World Bank's income classification. So we have the low-income countries, and then the lower middle income and the upper middle income countries are, bundled together as non-low income countries. And we find that their effects are not very different. So a conclusion, first empirical study in the literature to provide evidence of the impact of aid fragmentation on tax revenue. There are negative effects throughout. The negative effects are stronger on broad-based taxes relative to narrow-based taxes. And we argue strongly that it's the case because of the requisite investments, fiscal and institutional, required to collect and administer broad-based taxes. Institutions themselves are important for tax revenue, but they don't assuage the negative effects of aid fragmentation. And heterogeneity by the level of development is pointless because aid fragmentation has a negative effect across both sets of countries. In terms of policy implications, tax reform, that's policy and administration reform, is important for increasing taxes in developing countries, and it can be influenced by aid, technical assistance, and donor conditionality. So what we suggest is that if technical assistance is coordinated and donor conditionality efforts are coordinated as well, it reduces duplication and increases the effectiveness of aid. Coordination of lead donors is also important, especially for broad-based taxes, which require significant fiscal and institutional investments. For example, the VAT is one of the primary sources of tax revenue in developing countries, but its design is still very flawed, and there are also serious problems about its enforcement. And it's also very important to tap into bilateral and multilateral donors, those that have a comparative advantage in providing aid and technical assistance for tax revenue mobilization. So RE, the IMF, and the World Bank and those international organizations that are able to do that. And these are the references. You can skim through, and we're done.
I invite two speakers to come and join us up here for Q&A. We don't have much time according to the schedule, but I know that the lunch break is an hour. So I will take a little bit of time out of that. I hope we can make that social contract between us. Can we also get Alessandro on the screen so he can participate? I will basically start by opening the floor for questions. I hope you will bring some, because otherwise I have some. And I would actually also invite you to think about questions that you might have for each other, because I thought there were some really interesting exchanges when I read all 4 of your papers and when I listened to all 4 of you. But first, I think the floor, and we have one question here. And then
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. My name is Thomas. I'm from the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And I have one question to Alessandro and one question to Abrams. For Alessandro, I was wondering whether you somehow accounted for diffusion effects, or whether that's not an issue since you were using short-term effects and individual level data. And secondly, on whether you accounted for interventions by other donors somehow, because I guess in the aid data set there's exclusively for some donor, at least the geolocated data. And my question to Abrams. So what I take from the literature on fragmentation is that the effects are highly conditional on the sector of aid. So there's a paper by Sebastian Ciaya, More Donors, More Democracy, and that catchy title somehow gets the main message that the negative effect of fragmentation is highly conditional on the sector, with democracy aid having positive effects if it's more heterogeneous. So I was just wondering whether you included that in your robustness checks on whether different types of sectors affected your results differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, because I wrote about 6 questions, but now I have time only for 2, which I will combine. I was kind of shocked about the data that you presented about the illegitimate and legitimate government. So my question is, considering that the effectiveness principles, I'm not talking Paris, I'm talking Busan Plus, Global Partnership, are very much stood on local ownership of the national governments. So 2 questions related to that. How do you how does that work out in the realm of when we work with illegitimate governments, or how do you want to call it? And also from the sector now, you are aware that we are all about localization, about local ownership of development interventions and dividends. How do we do that with illegitimate governments? So how do you see that? Any of you, because I know that you have, because I was surprised to see that donor conditionalities, and okay, TA, fair enough, but the donor conditionalities come back into the equation, into the formula, whilst that was kind of not done for a very long time, not even politically correct to talk about it. So I'm curious to hear from any of you how you see this.
So the question, as I understand it, was really about that sort of issue of legitimate state, considering the focus on local ownership of development processes, and what does that mean for that? And if I may bring you into that conversation as well, because I heard a conversation between the two papers that you have where you highlight the importance of the local context. And if I read your paper correctly, there's actually sort of a cautioning of what inequalities in the local context you might exacerbate if you don't think about inclusion, exclusion also. So in that way, I think we actually have a question or a comment for all four of you, and I think it's absolutely excellent that the first one is for our online participant. So we don't forget you, which sometimes happens in these contexts where you work in hybrid formats. So please go ahead, Alessandro.
Well, thank you for the questions. So they're both very good. Well, diffusion effects, that might be, I totally agree with you. Probably not in terms of projects that are quite limited. We just use a project that have, an area of operation which is between province and region. But I agree with you that might be some, spillover effects on, motivation to people motivation to pay tax and tax moral. We did check actually spatially corrected standard error to account for this dependence in the residuals, and we reassuringly find robust results. Very quick on the second one, I completely agree with you. That might be other project. We just checking at the moment China project and Chinese project. We didn't find any overlap. We should check for other donors definitely. But I think this is a major reason of concern for the first ethical strategy. The second one, it's very, very difficult to find, one expected event during the field work survey design, and so I wouldn't expect any other. But it's nice to check. Thank you.
Great, and we move to Abrams. The question was on the importance of sectors, because the colleague referred to that's a good idea.
Okay. The question on sectoral aid is actually very true. There's a 2017 paper with World Development by Kai Gering and Axel Dreher and all, where they look at various development outcomes, so education, health, growth, and I think bureaucratic quality. What they found was that for social sectors like education and health, it actually benefits when there are, various donors on the scene or various donors on the landscape, such that they are able to benefit from a variety of ideas on how to implement their policies. Conversely, for bureaucratic quality and growth, it didn't benefit the recipient countries to have more donors. In the working paper version of this paper, we talk about the potential positive effects of, aid fragmentation on taxation. But for the presentation, we found that there is no point in talking about the potential benefit, positive effects, because what we are trying to argue is that for taxation, donor coordination is very important. For example, back in the days when the IMF conditionality was very strong, there was some conditionality about initiating trade liberalization, right? And what was happening was that the countries had to liberalize their trade, was going to lead to a reduction in trade revenues, which was meant to be compensated for by an increase in domestic taxes, especially the VAT and the CIT, which didn't really happen in all countries. So there was a net loss of revenue. In direct response to your question, I don't focus on different sectors. I focus only on taxation because that's a conceptual framework we're trying to develop. But then, like you said, the effects are conditional on the various development outcomes. They are also conditional on the specific kind of aid fragmentation index that you use. Likewise, we are seeing that fragmentation has a negative effect on tax revenue mobilization, but it's also very normal that donor concentration, especially in terms of technical assistance, is going to have a positive effect on tax revenue mobilization. And a donor concentration ratio is itself another measure of fragmentation. We also do some robustness analysis where we get aid data from the creditor reporting system. I think it's the code 1500 in terms of government and civil society. And we find that, that's the kind of aid which went specifically, we couldn't get data on domestic revenue mobilization specifically because there were too many missing variables. So we used the general government and civil society code, and we still found negative effects of aid on tax revenue mobilization under that. So in conclusion, we've ditched the potential positive effects of aid on tax revenue mobilization in the study, and we focused entirely on the negative effects, and we have some strong evidence of how aid fragmentation reduces tax revenue mobilization. The numbers are quite small, but again, like I said, we don't want to get bogged down by the numbers. We're quite interested in developing the conceptual framework, and we think it's solid enough. I mean, we're not Team Bestly and all, so we're not going to talk too much about it, but we think it's good enough.
Maybe just pass it straight to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if I got the question correctly. I think it's a very tricky one, I have to confess. Yeah, and too political. I think I totally agree. Yeah, that the way we approach it in the paper might be too arbitrary. Just classifying countries having legitimate or illegitimate states may be not reflective of the true picture. So, but I think what it probably can translate to is you can reach to a point where you have a crisis where people doesn't respect or affect state authority, and then have all kinds of implications in terms of tax collections and so on. So as I mentioned in the paper, so the point is trying to see how to correct that, because ideally the whole set of institutions should function in a way where actually the formal institutions evolve by reflecting the social relationships between the different parties and stakeholders in a country. And this is very hard to predict and have policy implications. But it's definitely a work in progress. So we'll try to find if we can have like better approaches in finding out more and more clearly how this could be done, especially in the context of aid effectiveness. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So quickly, no, I think that, like you said, I think in the case of Somalia, what we had realized is that we were working, somehow we were taking some sides because we were working with federal government, federal member states, and it was at the extent of working with, let's say, non-state actors or academics and so on. So I think that we just need to think more carefully about the fact of what are the impacts of what we do in terms of exclusion of some important stakeholders. And it's especially important because we usually have this imperative of short-term results. But and when we speak about fragile states, what is really important is the long-term perspective. So what you think is important in the short term of having some service delivery may actually backfire in the medium or long-term perspective, because if you exclude some important actors at some stage, it will backfire. So that's what I agree with you. I think that we don't think enough about what we do and what is the impact in terms of excluding a lot of important actors. Thanks.
And I guess that's also relates to the sort of development effectiveness language that really not only talk about country ownership, but inclusive country ownership. But any other questions or comments? I'm very bold. I know that we're just in between me and lunch, but I actually have a question for all four of you, and I think we can close with that, because I think I would sort of invite you to sort of a final comment or a reflection, and if you have any that relates to the fact that I think more or less all of you from the get-go takes a social contract approach to institution, society, development, And there are criticisms of that. Amartya Sen, who you probably know, in his idea of justice is somewhat, at least critical of sort of the theoretical social contract approach, and is more trying to argue a comparative, context-dependent approach to understanding institutions and relationships. And he's a big Democrat, argues that it's a universal value. So it's just curious to take that step back. It was something that struck me when I read all of your papers, and it's something we just, I think, take for granted also as practitioners when we work on these issues. So I will start again, Alessandro, with you. You're not bound by answering my sort of common question. You could also, if you have others, but sort of a minute or two of final thoughts from all four of you.
Well, I mean, it was really a great, session with very interesting paper. I definitely agree with you. I mean, we're all taking, the issue by looking at social contracts. But, there are pretty important studies that, told us that, fiscal capabilities is really, critical. And, you have to put people into account when you want to, start state building processes. So, and foreign aid, as all this paper are, documenting a really important, channel on this. So.
Yeah, a very, very quick response to your thought is that, from my perspective, all institutional reforms have to be grounded in the local contexts. That's very important, and because, as you know, the institutional evolution of the institutional setting is a kind of result of the interaction between the formal rules and then also the informal norms, the informal institutions, and then those reforms have to pay careful attention to the local contexts. And I think definitely it has a role to play. There is a variety of instruments and approaches that can be considered in trying to reflect that in assistance program. Not to be too long.
In terms of the social contract, I was focusing specifically on the social fiscal contract, right? So you pay your taxes and the government provides you with goods and services which are meant to benefit you and not just to the government, some kind of clientelism or patronage, which is intuitive because I think we've passed the stage where you can just bear down somebody's shop and break down their door and collect taxes, right? So now we've reached the point of voluntary compliance. And because voluntary compliance in itself is very difficult to achieve, we've now gone to quasi-voluntary compliance. And it's intuitive because if I feel that the services I'm getting are benefiting me, then I'm going to be more willing to pay my taxes. And there's a huge literature on that. And what we are trying to say is that the broad-based taxes, because of their lack of visibility, people know the rates that they are paying in terms of VAT. They understand the rates they are paying in terms of PIT. The companies know the CIT rates, but it's not very visible, So in terms of visibility, those broad-based taxes are not very observable, such that they require a lot of voluntary compliance, a lot of honesty. But instead, it's very difficult for the guy who is importing to lie about something at the border because the border is there for everybody to see. So that doesn't elicit some very strong voluntary compliance. So even if you don't comply with the tax rules, the tax authorities are quite likely to bear down your shop and, break down the door and collect the money. So that's the idea which I'm trying to portray in terms of the social fiscal contract.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think that's the reasons why we try to develop some reflections in Somalia is that I've seen it in a number of cases and countries, not only in Somalia, that sometimes we have this sort of a Weberian approach that, okay, we rebuild the institutions, we do service delivery, and the state somehow will become legitimate, and there will be trust in this state. It's of course, much more complex than that. And that's why I think that it's important because us as donors, we have the tendency to think that we have a simple recipe. And like it was said by Thierry, yes, we have a lot of factors are in place for having a trust in state, and we've seen it unfortunately also in some countries where I'm working now, that yes, some things have really improved in terms of education or health and so on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's really trust in authorities. And I think we need to take into account the different levels, because you may have actually some local authorities that are seen as more legitimate. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily inclusive. But I think that it's important to see the variety, and a social contract approach, I think, is just forcing us to think that it's a more complex process. And service delivery is important, but it's not sufficient. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have stability like that, especially in the long term. So that's why I think it's important. Thanks.
And talking about services, I think we should say thank you to all our presenters and go and have lunch.